George Harrison smiled for the cameras, looking every bit the beloved, successful rock icon. But behind the scenes, he was living in quiet agony, tormented by someone he once called a friend. For years, a fellow Beatle controlled every note George played, mocked his spiritual beliefs, and treated him like he didn't belong. George kept quiet until he couldn't anymore. In 1969, something inside him snapped. In the middle of a recording session, with cameras rolling, George stood up, said nothing, and walked out. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was the result of years of being dismissed, humiliated, and ignored. But that wasn't the worst of it. When George hit rock bottom, this person crossed a line no true friend ever should. A betrayal so deep, George carried the anger with him to his dying breath. Today, we reveal the untold truth about the Beatle George Harrison, resented more than anyone, and the heartbreaking reason why. George Harrison entered the world on the 25th of February, 1943, in a tiny brick house at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool. That night, the city shook under its 78th consecutive night of German bombing. It was a war zone, and George was born right in the middle of it. His father, Harold, worked as a bus conductor, walking miles each day just to save on fare, earning barely enough to get by. His mother, Louise, scrubbed office floors at night for pennies. George and his brothers shared a bed until he was 16. Their weekly food budget? 15 shillings, barely enough to survive. And yet, there was love in that little home. Louise somehow filled it with warmth, music, and laughter. In 1955, George was just 12, riding his bike through the neighborhood when he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel drifting through an open window. He stopped, frozen. Something in that sound cracked him open. When he got home, he looked at his mother and said, "I need a guitar more than I need food." That wasn't just a childhood whim, it was the spark that would consume his entire life. At age 14, George finally got what he'd begged for, a guitar. It wasn't much. A cheap, painful Eggman flat-top from Frank Hesse's music shop. The strings cut into his fingers. They bled for weeks. But George didn't care. He practiced 6 to 8 hours a day, pushing through the pain. His first song, Rock Island Line. School quickly faded into the background. He failed nearly every subject except art. His teacher even wrote on a report, "George cares more about guitars than geometry." That same year, fate stepped in again. On a crowded Liverpool bus, George met Paul McCartney. Paul noticed the guitar on George's back and asked what he could play. George answered confidently, 20 Flight Rock, a tough song. Paul was impressed. Soon after, George auditioned for Paul's band, the Quarrymen. He nailed Raunchy at just 14 years and 364 days old. John Lennon hesitated. George was just a kid, but his talent couldn't be denied. He became the youngest member of what would become the most famous band in history. But this journey wouldn't be easy. Even with raw talent, George would always have to fight to be seen. Most teenage musicians have to beg for a ride or sneak in practice after school. George Harrison had something different, an entire family sacrificing everything so he could chase his dream. His mother, Louise, picked up a third job cleaning the smoky floors of the Cavern Club just to pay for music gear. His father, Harold, let him ride the bus for free, risking his job every time. When George needed a better guitar, the family didn't hesitate, they sold their piano. And when the band had their first paid gig, Louise did something almost no mother would. She pawned her wedding ring to help them rent an amplifier. Every cent, every ounce of energy went into George's music. Then came a turning point. One night during a show, Paul McCartney froze, he couldn't play his solo. The band panicked. It became clear they needed a real lead guitarist. Paul pushed hard for George, but Lennon still wasn't sure. So they arranged a second audition on the top of a double-decker bus. George played Raunchy again, and this time, Lennon gave in. He was in, but even then, he wasn't seen as an equal, more like a little brother tagging along. George Harrison didn't just join the band, he helped change it. When he and Paul began modifying their guitars and added pickups, the Beatles shifted from skiffle to full-blown rock and roll. They bought a second-hand El Pico amp, and suddenly, the group had teeth. George's technical skills became essential, but inside the band, he was still treated like the kid brother. Lennon barely saw him as an equal. His ideas were brushed aside. The age gap, just 3 years, felt like a wall. Then came Hamburg. In 1960, the Beatles were booked to play brutal marathon sets at the Kaiserkeller, 8 hours a day, stretching songs for as long as possible just to fill time. Their sleeping space was behind the stage, filthy, freezing, and shared with other bands. The club's bouncer was a killer, literally a former boxer who had beaten a man to death in a street fight. George was only 17, but he survived it all. Night after night, song after song. He learned how to endure. By the time they got back to England, George Harrison wasn't just a kid with a guitar. He was a professional. But that didn't mean he would be treated like one. The 9th of February, 1964. The Beatles stepped onto the stage of the Ed Sullivan Show and into history. 73 million people watched live. That was over 60% of every television set in America. CBS received 50,000 ticket requests for a studio that only held 728 seats. Even President Nixon's daughters were in the crowd. The Beatles played 5 songs. America screamed. When John Lennon appeared, the caption under his name read, "Sorry girls, he's married." Beatlemania exploded. The British invasion had begun. But for George Harrison, something felt off. Just months before that legendary performance, George had taken a quiet but important step. He wrote his first Beatles song, "Don't Bother Me." He was sick, stuck in a hotel bed, and picked up a tape recorder out of boredom. A journalist had pushed him to start writing, and George had snapped, "Don't Bother Me." The phrase became the title. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't polished, but it meant something deeper. For the first time, George Harrison proved he could be more than just the quiet one. He could be a songwriter too. The only question was, would anyone let him? After Don't Bother Me, George Harrison had tasted what it felt like to create his own music. But inside the Beatles machine, creation came with conditions. From 1965 onward, there was an unspoken rule. John and Paul wrote the songs. George was allowed maybe 2 per album, no more. Paul would later admit, "We never said, let's keep George out," but it was implied. Even when George brought good material, it was often dismissed. Lennon, McCartney, and producer George Martin saw him as the junior partner, someone to fill space, not lead. It didn't matter that George's playing shaped their sound or that his lyrics were evolving. His songs were politely passed over, his voice muted. He was the quiet one, that's what the press called him. Lennon was the smart one. Paul was the cute one. Ringo was the lucky one. And George, he was left in the background. But behind that silence, frustration was building. Album after album, tour after tour, George Harrison had something to say and no one willing to listen. And soon, that quiet frustration would erupt into something no one could ignore. By 1965, George Harrison was done waiting for approval. He started seeking something no song credit could give him peace. That same year, he took his first LSD trip, slipped into his drink by a dentist without warning. It shook him, opened something inside him. That summer, during a visit to Elvis Presley's home, George heard about yoga and something clicked. Soon he was reading books by Swami Vishnu Devananda, Vivekananda, Yogananda, looking for answers the Beatles couldn't give him. Then, in 1966, came the moment that changed everything. While filming Help at Twickenham Studios, George spotted a strange instrument backstage, a sitar. The sound intrigued him, unlike anything he'd ever heard. While the others were getting high, George was picking up the sitar, fumbling, learning, listening. Most musicians would stop there. George didn't. A year later, in 1966, he met Ravi Shankar, the legendary sitar master, and within weeks, cleared his schedule to travel across India. Normally, Ravi made students wait years, but George was different. He asked questions constantly. He wasn't dabbling, he was serious. That October, George recorded the sitar part for Norwegian Wood. It was the first time an Indian instrument appeared on a Western pop song. He had found a new voice, but instead of admiration, what he got from his bandmates was smirks. And the deeper he went into spiritual music, the more alone he became in the band. George Harrison's sitar wasn't a gimmick, it was a doorway. But to the rest of the Beatles, it felt like a distraction. In 1968, they all went to India to study with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. George was focused. He wanted to meditate, to go deeper, but Paul had other ideas. He kept writing songs for what would become the White Album. At one point, George snapped. "We're not here to do the next album. We're here to meditate." That clash wasn't just creative, it was personal. Paul didn't understand George's spiritual path. He saw it as a phase. George saw it as salvation. It wasn't long before George stopped trying to explain himself. During Sgt. Pepper, he submitted a song, only a Northern song. It criticized how the band handled credits and royalties. Lennon and McCartney rejected it outright. They gave him just one track, Within You, Without You. He recorded it alone. No John, no Paul, no Ringo. George sat in the studio with Indian musicians, creating something beautiful, and no one else showed up. When strings were added later, even George Martin didn't invite the others. The silence was deafening. Lennon would later call it one of George's best songs. But back then, they couldn't even bother to be in the room. By the time George brought Within You, Without You to life, he wasn't just making music, he was trying to express his soul. But Paul didn't see it that way. He laughed, he rolled his eyes. He'd leave the room during George's sessions. What was sacred to George was a punchline to Paul. George once said, "They didn't even try to understand what I was bringing." That pain ran deep, because to George, this wasn't just art, it was his path to peace. Everyone liked to say the Beatles were democratic, that everyone had a say. But inside the studio, it was John and Paul calling the shots. George was allowed 1 or 2 songs per album, if that. Even when his songs were good, they were sidelined. Even when they were better, they were ignored. He didn't own his publishing like they did. He was paid less, credited less, respected less. Bob Dylan saw it clearly. He once said, George had to fight to get anything on the records. And he was right. George wasn't a bandmate. He was being treated like an assistant. By 1967, he had a stack of songs the others wouldn't even bother to hear. One of them was called All Things Must Pass. And just like George, it was ahead of its time. By the Let It Be sessions in early 1969, George Harrison had reached his limit. He brought All Things Must Pass to the studio. Lennon and McCartney shrugged it off, said it didn't fit. They dismissed it like they always did. George was done begging. That same session was already tense. Paul kept nitpicking his guitar parts, telling him what and how to play again. Finally, George looked at him and said the now famous line, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was resigned. And that's what made it so powerful. 4 days later, he left. No explosion, no slam of the door, just a quiet, devastating exit. He went home, wrote a new song, ate some chips, and recorded a demo. The song? Wah Wah, his way of describing the Beatles. A headache. Loud, chaotic, and overwhelming. He didn't offer it to the band when he returned a few days later. Instead, he gave them I, Me, Mine, a clear message. From now on, the best of George Harrison was no longer for the Beatles. When George Harrison came home from the studio, he wasn't just frustrated, he was angry, drained, and bitter. His wife, Pattie Boyd, saw it. The man who once lit up rooms with music now came home in silence. The arguments were constant. The tension followed him like a shadow. And it wasn't just creative strain, it was personal. George and Paul barely spoke. Pattie once said George didn't even like Paul's personality. He couldn't hide his contempt anymore. While George tried to escape through spirituality, the Beatles were tearing him apart. When he agreed to return to the band after walking out, he didn't do it blindly. he made demands. Sessions had to move from Twickenham to Apple Studios. The live television concert? Cancelled. Most importantly, he wanted more space for his songs. It was humiliating that he had to ask. John made it worse. Half joking, he said, "We'll just get Eric Clapton if you don't come back." It stung. But George came back anyway, maybe out of love, maybe out of habit. But nothing really changed. The damage had been done, and the cracks that had formed in the studio, they were about to reach into his home life. George Harrison's personal life, already strained by band tensions, took a darker turn behind closed doors. On the surface, his marriage to Pattie Boyd seemed like a fairy tale. They'd met on the set of A Hard Day's Night, married in 1966, and looked like the golden couple of the British rock world. But inside their home, cracks were widening. By 1970, George's closest friend, Eric Clapton, was secretly in love with Pattie. He wrote her passionate letters, even composed Layla to win her over. When Pattie showed one of the letters to George's, thinking it was just a fan's note, she discovered it was from Eric. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than most. But what followed was even more shocking. George himself began an affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. He didn't hide it. During a dinner party, he looked Ringo in the eye and said, "I'm in love with your wife." Ringo, stunned but trying to stay calm, replied, "Better you than someone we don't know." But the real explosion came later. When Pattie caught them locked in a bedroom at George's estate, she pounded on the door screaming. Georgia laughed. When John Lennon heard about it, he called it virtual incest. By 1975, both marriages collapsed. Two Beatles families torn apart, not by fame, but by one man's choices. To the public, George Harrison was the peaceful one, the spiritual one, the enlightened Beatle. But those closest to him saw something else entirely. His second wife, Olivia, chose her words carefully. She said, "George just loved women." Ringo was less diplomatic. He called him a bag of beads and a bag of anger. George preached detachment from ego, yet surrounded himself with supermodels. He spoke of simplicity, yet lived in a 120-room mansion, Friar Park more palace than home. He told fans to let go of materialism, but collected rare cars and indulged in luxuries most couldn't imagine. His battles with addiction didn't stop after the Beatles' psychedelic era. In the 1972nd, George was smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day and using cocaine regularly. He'd warn others like Elton John about the dangers of drugs, even while he was still deep in them. Friends said being around him was like dealing with 2 different people. One moment he was calm and centered, the next lost in rage or buried in chemicals. He was chasing peace, but couldn't seem to outrun himself. In 1970, George Harrison finally did what the Beatles never let him do. He let it all out. All Things Must Pass wasn't just an album, it was a declaration. A triple LP packed with the songs they had ignored for years. Songs like My Sweet Lord, Isn't It a Pity, Wah Wah, and All Things Must Pass, each one proof that George had been ready all along. It hit number 1. Critics hailed it as the war and peace of rock and roll. Lennon and McCartney couldn't touch it. Not then. Not like that. George had gone from being allowed 2 songs per Beatles record to carrying 3 albums by himself, and he didn't stop there. In 1971, he joined John Lennon on How Do You Sleep, a brutal takedown of Paul. George's slide guitar sliced through the track as Lennon tore into Paul's ego and music. Even Ringo showed up to cool tensions, but George stayed, silent, focused, playing through the pain. Later that year, George did what no rock star had ever done before. He organized the concert for Bangladesh. 2 sold-out shows at Madison Square Garden. Bob Dylan, Clapton, Billy Preston, even Ringo showed up. Paul didn't. By 1985, the concerts and album raised nearly $12 million. George didn't just prove he could write, he proved he could lead. As George's solo career soared, the Beatles crumbled into legal war. In December 1970, Paul McCartney sued the others to formally dissolve the band. George, John, and Ringo fought back not to save the Beatles, but to stop Paul from winning. They even filed affidavits claiming the band could still go on. It was a lie, and they all knew it. The court sided with Paul. The Beatles' assets were frozen, then divided, and just like that, it was over. George had chosen his side. It wasn't Paul's. Years passed, but the wounds didn't. In 1988, when the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Paul didn't show. Ringo was reportedly drunk. That left George alone, on stage, accepting the honor for the band that had made him, then nearly broken him. He kept his speech light, said they all loved John, said they all loved Paul, but the message was clear. The Beatles were legends, but they were no longer brothers. On the 29th of November, 2001, George Harrison took his last breath inside a quiet Los Angeles home. He was 58. He didn't die with a guitar in his hand. He didn't die surrounded by Beatles memorabilia or platinum records. Instead, his final words were passed on through his wife Olivia and son Darnie. Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait. That was George's flawed, brilliant, broken, and searching. For all the betrayals, for all the anger he carried toward Paul and the band that never truly embraced him as an equal, he never stopped looking for something more, something beyond fame, beyond ego, beyond music. He had lived through wars on stage, in studios, in his own home, and in his own mind. And yet, when it all ended, he left with only one message. Let go, seek peace, go inward. Because in the end, the quiet Beatle was never really quiet at all. He was just listening for something no one else could hear. If this story moved you, if you felt the quiet ache behind George's music, his struggle to be heard, and his search for something greater, don't let it end here. There are more untold stories like this. Stories buried behind the spotlight in the shadows of fame, where truth lives quietly. So if you believe legends deserve more than headlines, subscribe, like, and stay with us as we uncover what really happened after the applause fades.